In this video, we're going to cover scope of constants and variables. I feel like we've already covered a lot of this, but we're just going to make sure that it is a topic that we can cross off of our list. I'm going to go ahead and open the scope.swift file. The very first thing I want to do is I want to start by defining a constant. This is going to be name of type string, and we're going to set it equal to Jenny. I can go ahead and print out this variable, and when we do this, our name is a local variable to the code that we're writing in our main line here. I can go ahead and save that, and if I go ahead and execute the code, we can see that it prints out Jenny. If I come back in here and I decide that I'm going to put in a function and I'm going to make this print name, it's going to accept no arguments and it's just going to go ahead and print out the name. And I need to put in a call to this function, so I'm going to go ahead underneath and call the print name function. When I do this, this name is considered to be a global variable. It's outside of the scope of the print name function, but the print name has access to any global variables that are defined in this file. And since it's not overriding the name variable within this function, it's going to then be printing out the global variable of Jenny, and we should see it printed out 2 times when we save this. Now if I go ahead and instead of allowing it to print out the name, and I decide that I'm going to do a let name of type string is equal to Mark, and I save that, when I print out the name using the print name function, I should now see Mark coming out. Now let's go ahead and execute that and see that that is the case. Now when we talk about this, we're defining that local variable name within our print name function, and what we say is that this name that we define locally is shadowing this global variable name that we have defined within the file itself. So it's shadowing that original name variable or constant that we define when we define something locally, and it's going to use the value that we create locally instead of printing out something of the global variable. Now if we go ahead and we create another function, and in this case we're going to do something like print major, and this time we want to declare our major as an optional string, I can do this in a couple different ways and have the variable shadow the actual value that's being passed in. In the case that we want to start with, I can say if let major equals major, and when I do this, the value that is inside of my curly braces here is going to be the unwrapped version of the major. So essentially we're taking our optional value, we're unwrapping it, and then assigning it back to the same name, kind of overshadowing the original value that we can then use within the block that we have here defined. So in this case we would be printing our major, and we should see chemistry being printed out if we pass in chemistry here. So if we go ahead and say major, pass in chemistry, that's what we should see printed out. So in this case, again, the major that's being passed in, we are assigning it the actual unwrapped version if it's not nil to major, and then that major is the unwrapped value that we show that we're printing here in this print statement within the block associated to that if condition. Now, if we decide that we want to try to use a guard, I'm going to go ahead and just comment out this block, but I'm going to also copy it. And instead of doing an if, we're using a guard, and the guard is going to let the major equal to major, else it's going to return. And then we can go ahead and print out the major at this point. And what it's doing here is essentially the same thing. It's taking the input, which is an optional string. It's then going ahead and unwrapping it if it can. If it can't, it's just going to return. If it can, then the value that major has for the rest of the actual function is the unwrapped version. And if I go ahead and print major again, if I go ahead and save this, execute it, it's going to show me chemistry once again. Next, we're going to take a look at using a class. So I'm going to copy in a class definition for a student. And this particular student has a first name, a last name, and an email property. And we have an initializer that we have set up where we have a parameter coming in of a student first name, a parameter coming in of a student last name, and then a parameter coming in of a student email. And we can go ahead then and take our input, which is student first name, student last name, and student email, and assign them to the variables that have been defined within this class, those properties. Now, this is one way that we can do it. We can use explicit names that are different, and then we don't need to use that self property like we were using before. And I can go ahead and I can execute a method here using all of that. So I'm going to go ahead and copy in a call to this. And then, of course, we can print out the information using the toString to validate that we have, in fact, changed the values within the properties of that instance. And I'm going to go ahead and save this. And we can run this. And we can see that there is a first name, a last name, and an email. Now, typically, it's not the practice that we use different names for the input on our initializers. We typically use the exact same names that are for the properties within the file itself as input. So let's change this up just a little bit. But when we do this, we have input values coming in, and then we have properties within the class that are named the same. We have to be able to tell which one is the property that we're setting versus the input, and we do that by executing the self dot, and that self dot basically indicates that the instances properties are being set as opposed to the input being passed in. So we have our first name that's being passed in instead of our student name, and we're using that to set the property within the class within the instance. So I'm going to go ahead and change out this and make it self.lastname. Change it to email and make this self.email. Now I need to come down here and change these up to be first name, last name, and then email. And if I go ahead and save that and run it again, everything is working just fine. And we are saying here that we have variables being passed in, and we're setting them within the instance. And this is overshadowing the input that's being passed in.